Flag United States the 400 Americans who held back 2,000 British soldiers. The Maryland 400 American Revolution documentary. Intro. The Impossible Choice. Narrator. August 27, 1776. Brooklyn. The American Revolution was only a little more than a year old. The United States did not yet exist. There was no independent nation, no professional American army, no guarantee that the rebellion would survive. And on a battlefield outside New York, George Washington's army was facing one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The British had arrived with thousands of soldiers. Among them were highly trained British regulars and German troops commonly known as Hessians. The American position was collapsing. Men were retreating. Units were becoming separated. The British were pushing deeper into the American lines. And behind the American soldiers stood something even more important than the battlefield itself. New York City. If Washington's army was destroyed, the revolution could be crushed before it had truly begun. Then, in the middle of the chaos, approximately 400 American soldiers were ordered to do something that sounded almost impossible. Hold the enemy back. Not for an entire day. Not for an entire week. Just long enough for the rest of the army to escape. They knew what was coming. They knew the odds. And they attacked anyway. History would eventually remember them as the Maryland 400. But the real story is even bigger. Because those men did not simply fight for a battlefield. They fought for the survival of the American Revolution. Chapter 1. America is at war. To understand what happened in Brooklyn, we have to go back to the beginning. In 1775, fighting had broken out between American colonists and Great Britain. The conflict began in Massachusetts. But what started as a rebellion quickly became a full-scale war. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army. His soldiers came from different colonies. They had different backgrounds, different equipment, different levels of training, and many had never fought in a large conventional battle before. The British military was different. Britain had one of the most experienced armies in the world. Its soldiers had fought across Europe, North America, and other parts of the British Empire. The British also had a powerful navy. And now Britain was preparing to strike the American rebellion at its heart. That target was New York. New York was strategically important. Control of the city meant control of one of the most important ports in North America. It also provided access to the Hudson River. For Washington, losing New York would be dangerous. But losing his army would be catastrophic. So the Continental Army prepared for the British attack. And in the summer of 1776, the largest British military operation of the American Revolution was beginning. Chapter 2. The British Army arrives. Imagine standing near New York Harbor in August 1776. The water is filled with ships. Thousands of British soldiers are arriving. More ships appear on the horizon. Then more. The scale is enormous. British forces under General William Howe had gathered an army numbering in the tens of thousands, supported by German auxiliary troops. These German soldiers are often simply called Hessians, although the term actually covered troops from several German states. Britain hired tens of thousands of German troops during the Revolution, with a large proportion coming from Hesse-Kassel. To American soldiers watching from the shore, the sight must have been intimidating. This was no small raid. Britain was bringing a massive army to defeat the rebellion. Washington understood what was at stake. He positioned his army around New York and Long Island. American troops constructed defenses. Earthworks were built. Soldiers dug trenches. Cannons were positioned. The Continental Army waited. But Washington faced a difficult problem. He had to defend a huge area with an army that was still developing. The British only needed to find a weakness. And eventually they did. Chapter 3. The American Defense. Long Island contained forests, hills, roads, and narrow passages. The Americans established defensive positions across the island. One important area was around the Gowanus Road and nearby terrain. American troops were spread across several positions. Among them were soldiers from Maryland and Delaware. These men were part of the Continental Army. They were not superheroes. They were ordinary soldiers facing an extraordinary situation. Some were young. Some were experienced. They carried muskets with fixed bayonets. Their uniforms and equipment varied. Their training was not always equal to that of British regulars. But they had one advantage. They knew that they were fighting for something they believed belonged to them: their homes, their families, their colonies, and increasingly their independence. But belief alone could not stop an army. On August 27, 1776, the British attack began. Chapter 4: The Battle of Long Island. The battlefield quickly became chaotic. British and German forces attacked American positions from multiple directions. Gunfire echoed through the woods. Cannons fired. Smoke filled the battlefield. American units struggled to understand what was happening. Some American soldiers were surrounded. Others were forced to retreat. The British advanced. The American line began breaking apart. Washington watched as the situation became increasingly dangerous. If the British could push through the American defenses, they could potentially trap large parts of the Continental Army. The Americans needed to retreat toward Brooklyn Heights. But there was a major obstacle: Gowanus Creek. The creek and surrounding marshy ground created a difficult escape route. American troops had to cross under pressure. Washington needed time. Time for soldiers to withdraw. Time to move supplies. Time to reorganize. Time to save the army. But someone had to remain behind. And this is where the story of the Maryland and Delaware soldiers becomes extraordinary. Chapter 5: 2,000 Enemy Soldiers. The American retreat was underway, but British and Hessian forces were closing in. Approximately 2,000 British infantry and Hessian troops surrounded the American rearguard. Inside this collapsing battlefield were roughly 400 Maryland and Delaware survivors. They were exhausted. Many had already fought. Some were wounded. Some had watched friends fall. And now they faced an enemy several times their size. The logical decision would have been surrender. But there was a problem. If they surrendered immediately, the British could move forward. And if the British moved forward quickly enough, they could catch more of Washington's army. The 400 had a job: delay the enemy. And suddenly, these soldiers were no longer simply fighting for themselves. They were buying time. Chapter 6: The Old Stone House. Near the battlefield stood a building known as the Old Stone House. British soldiers occupied positions around it. From there, they could fire into the American retreat. The building and surrounding area became a key point in the fighting. The Americans were under